So let's begin by looking at how events are connected up to elements and disconnected. That happens using the bind and unbind functions in jQuery. And just like other jQuery functions, you use a selector to select a group of objects in the page that you want to place event handlers on. And then to create an event handler, you use the bind function. And to remove that event handler function later on, if you want to, you can use unbind. So let's take a look at functions and how they work. So for bind, there's a couple of parameters. There's the event, the data, and the handler parameters. So the event parameter basically defines the event that you want to be bound to, and it's a string that is the name of the event. For example, you'd pass in a string named click, or mouse down, or key down, or whatever event it is that you want to bind to. The data parameter is optional, and it basically defines a piece of data that will be passed into the event handler function when the event happens and that function is called. If you don't want to use it, you don't have to, but it's a convenient way of passing some data to your event handler. And then finally, the last parameter is the handler function itself, and that's the function that will handle the event, and we'll see an example of that. If you want to unbind the event, so for example, if you have a need to turn events on and off, you simply use the unbind function, and again, you pass the name of the event that you want to unbind, and then for the handler function parameter, you pass the name of the function that you used to bind with. So if you want to unbind it, you can't use an anonymous function. You have to have a function that you're unbinding. So that's the bind and unbind functions. One of the nice convenience things about bind is that you can pass multiple event names for the event parameter in one string that are just separated by a space, and we'll see an example of that in a moment. So let's take a moment and have a look at an example. Let's jump over to the code. You can see that what we have here is a div in the page, and we're going to bind some events to this element to make it change color, and we're going to see if we can find a way to turn off events as well. So let's go back to the source code and do that. So we've got a couple of style sheets defined. This is the normal style sheet, and I've made it yellow with 18 points, and that's this div right here. And then this is the highlighted style sheet. This is the style sheet that we want to have added when an event happens. And what we're going to do is define a rollover effect so that when the user moves the mouse into and out of the element, it highlights and unhighlights. So up here in the top of my page, I've got my document ready function. So I'm going to go ahead and write some code to bind an event to this element. So I'm going to write $. I'm going to get the ID for the event target, and that's EVT target. All right, that's the ID of there it is right there. So on this div, I'm going to bind, and I'm going to bind an event for the mouse over, and I'm going to call the highlight function. So now what I need to do is write the highlight function. So I'm going to write function highlight, and event handler functions in jQuery always take an event object parameter. Even though we're not going to use it, I'm just going to highlight it there so you can see it. And in the highlight function, we're going to get a reference to the event target div. And we're going to call the toggle class function because we want to set the highlight class onto the div. And that's this guy right here. So when the mouse goes over it, it's going to highlight, and we're going to do mouse leave. So we're going to call the same highlight function for both mouse over and mouse leave, and that's because we're toggling the class. So if highlighted is present, it'll be taken off. If it's not there, it'll be added on. So let's now switch out to the browser and see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up in the browser. And you can see that as I'm moving over the element, it's highlighting. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's go back to the code and get a little more fancy. So now what I'm going to do is bind a click handler. And the click handler is going to shut off the highlighting function. So for the click handler, we're going to do pretty much the same thing. We're going to bind the event target. Okay, And we're going to bind a click handler. And the click handler is going to be just an anonymous inline function. And that function is going to do the opposite of these guys. So we're going to copy that, paste those guys in there, and we're going to call unbind on both of these guys. So now when I click, and in fact, let's also just tell the user, hey, you shut the thing off. So let's get this and call the HTML. Remember this from our manipulating content chapter. We're going to set the HTML of the div to be a paragraph that says you turned off highlighting. Let's go back to the browser and we're going to refresh. Okay, now you can see when I click, I change the content and the highlighting no longer works. So that's pretty much binding and unbinding. So let's move on to our next lesson.